Hello and welcome to the second part of the chapter 23 of the American pageant for AP U.S. History or dual enrollment U.S. History. Today we're going to cover the section between Hayes and Tilden Standoff, the election of 1876, all the way through Presidents Garfield and Arthur. We're coming to you live for, maybe not live for you, but from my classroom, instead of at home, instead of the dinky basement with all the junk. So let's get right into it. Enough of this stuff. The presidency, Congress passed a resolution to basically limit the president to 2 terms. Grant was considering a 3rd term, and Grant, by all measures, is a pretty poor president. Good general, don't get me wrong, but not a very good president. He's probably on the $50 bill, mainly because of his work in the Civil War. And so there really just was a fear that Grant was going to run for a 3rd term. He was really considering it. The Republicans choose Rutherford B. Hayes, which is probably one of the stranger first names in American history. Rutherford, I'm not sure if you shorten that to Ruth or Ruther or Ford or what, but he's the candidate in 1876. The Democrats chose Samuel J. Tilden. Very, very, very close election. The popular vote goes to Samuel Tilden, but he was 1 vote shy in the Electoral College, 184 to 185. There was disputed returns in the South because of Reconstruction, because of issues with the occupation with the military. There was disputed returns in Louisiana, in South Carolina, and of course Florida, because Florida is known for really running efficient elections. 2000 election, never mind. But that's kind of going on. And so whichever electoral votes they take from those states, the winner would win. The candidate would get that election. So if the Republicans won those 3 states, Hayes wins it. If Tilden wins those 3 states, he would win it. And so they have an electoral commission. Each state sent 2 ballot counts, and then the commission had to investigate which set of votes to accept. Controversy arose over which candidate should be awarded the disputed electoral votes. You can look at the electoral map here and see that everything in red was Republican. It was Hayes, which got most of the North, with the exception of like New York and Connecticut and some of those places. You got Colorado, my home state, on the map finally, yay. And then the blue was mainly the South and Midwest. And you can kind of see a little preview of how the electoral commission settled with Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. You can see that those 3 red states in the South really kind of stand out. So the Democrats tried to block Hayes' election in order when the electoral commission chose the Republicans. They had a 1 vote advantage in this commission. There was 8 Republicans, 7 Democrats. And finally, the compromise wins out. Literally just days before Inauguration Day, Hayes is awarded the election with the agreement that the federal troops, the occupation of the South, which had begun all the way during the Civil War and after the end of it in 1865, would be finally pulled out of the South. And so they would not be occupied in those 10 states, the 11 Confederate states with the exception of Tennessee, which was readmitted before the war was over. They would be pulled out. And so that's how Rutherford B. Hayes wins the presidency, even though Samuel Tilden won the election in terms of the popular vote. Although that's happened before in 1824 with Jackson and John Quincy Adams. It happened in 1888. It also happens in 2000 and then 2016. It's happening a lot lately. It's kind of strange. With the troops out of the South, any idea of racial equality, first-class citizenship for African Americans really vanishes. Congress before this tried to kind of prevent what was happening in the South, the growing tide of Democrats returning to power, the KKK intimidating African Americans into not voting. They tried to pass the Civil Rights Act as a last-ditch effort to preserve progress in the South. It doesn't work. With the federal troops not there to babysit, the South kind of returns to its old ways, and they put African Americans back to second-class citizenship. Through poll taxes, through literacy tests, through intimidation, threatening to take away jobs or not rent to people if they voted. And so really, and then through violence and lynching and all those terrible, awful things, they kind of set up slavery in disguise, to which necessitates the Civil Rights Acts, the Civil Rights Movement in the 50s and 60s. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 was declared unconstitutional in 1883. And so Democrats quickly returned to power in the South. And they set up a power structure with intimidation to keep African Americans in their place, and so whites could rule, and the Democrats were back in charge. And sadly, African Americans enjoyed freedom, enjoyed liberty and voting and even represented in government, and then they returned to virtual bondage. You have a political cartoon here which shows the strong government, the carpetbaggers, the Northerners, the corrupt officials that were being carried on the back of the Old South, the Lady Liberty, escorted by federal troops. And then you have the weak government, as it's in quotes, and then the Southern man is back to taking care of their own things and plowing up all those old social ills. Here's the makeup of the Electoral Commission that gave the election to Hayes. You can see it's 8 Republicans to 7 Democrats. And so you get the birth of Jim Crow in the post-Reconstruction South. White Democrats, or the Redeemers, enacted laws discriminating against African Americans. Blacks were forced into sharecropping and tenant farming. They had to give a share of their crops as payment. They had to pay for their food. They had to pay for their equipment. They had to pay rent. And they had laws, phony laws in the South, not phony, but they were laws set up to basically to keep African Americans working in the fields. If they owed a debt, they weren't allowed to leave the land. If they were unemployed, they had to go work in a plantation. And they weren't allowed to see their books. They weren't allowed to see the ledger to see that, hey, you owed money or that you got charged too much for your seed this year. And so it is virtually slavery in disguise. This perpetual debt forced them to continue to work for the owners. They had state-level legal codes which segregated. They became known as Jim Crow laws. And so they codified and made it legal that whites and blacks would be separate in virtually everything, from schools to train cars to recreation activities to hotels, drinking fountains, eventually even cemeteries and beaches and pools, you name it. Jim Crow was named after an old minstrel character from the South where whites would dress in blackface, which is extremely racist and offensive, but they used to think it was funny to kind of mock the, lack of intelligence that they perceived in African Americans. Southern states also enacted literacy requirements. They had to take phony tests. Voter registration laws, which forbade African Americans. Poll taxes actually charged people to vote, which basically set up a system where African Americans, there was no hope that in many states, especially like Mississippi, they didn't even register to vote. They didn't even bother. And so they go back to kind of servitude and not having a voice in government. And whites are once again the elites and they're back in power. Like I said earlier, which necessitates the civil rights movement, which really took a long time to get going. There's a lot of seeds of it that are planted in the teens and the 20s, a lot of that movement. And then you have the Great Migration during World War I. And then really with World War II and the Great Depression, and World War II, you get really kind of the civil rights movement as we know it, which you'll learn later in this class. The Supreme Court actually ruled that segregation was okay. In the monumental and very disappointing Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal facilities for blacks was okay. They could have separate rail cars, which the ruling was over, as long as they were equal facilities. So they could have separate schools, separate hospitals, you name it, but they had to be equal. And they found that under the 14th Amendment, which, in reality, things were not equal, but that's how the Supreme Court just kind of justified it, which led to second-class citizenship. And then sadly, those African Americans who tasted liberty and freedom and voice in government, some of them were not willing to go quietly back into servitude. A lot of them were outspoken, and so lynchings rose at an alarming rate in the 1890s. Basically, the KKK and other whites intimidated African Americans into not speaking up and going back into their virtual servitude. You have a picture here of an African American gentleman being lynched by a white mob. Very shocking, very sad, and it's just the reality of the South at that time. This is a map showing how a plantation was, and how the slaves lived right around the master's house, and they were all kind of right there. And then fast forward 21 years, and they're still living in the same area. They're just spread out. They have their own little cabins, which aren't, they're not great, but, at least they have a church, they have school, they have a little bit more opportunity, but the South set up systems where they were pretty much tied to the land. Instead of being the slave owner, they're now, a landlord is what they are. These are the number of people lynched in the United States by race from 1882 to 2005. You can see that it really spikes in the 1890s. Sadly, it's still going on in some places. There's still really bad things going on in all the country. But even in 2001, you had a spike of even whites being lynched in 1885. In fact, the first Columbus Day was held in this country because President Cleveland, there was white Italians lynched in New Orleans over an issue and wanted to try to, I guess, appease or help Italians feel prideful, and so they started the first observation of Columbus Day, which in itself is controversial in itself today. So moving on, other class conflicts and ethnic clashes going on. Class struggles really emerge after the Reconstruction. I mean, really, we have this influx of cash from the government from those contracts in the Civil War, and so the rich are really getting a lot richer. I mean, they're very powerful. This is the Gilded Age. The Depression of 1873 really hurt the lower classes. Railroad workers struck in 1877 for a 10% pay cut. At that time, going on strike and being in a labor union they weren't even sure if it was legal. In a lot of places, it was flat out illegal to do. And most Americans at that time equated strikes and unions with violence. President Hayes sent in federal troops to kind of to squash or I guess force the workers back into their employment. It backfired. There was also work stoppages that spread to Baltimore, to St. Louis. Over 100 were killed in these labor battles between federal troops and workers, and it was very violent. And so people really struggled with labor unions because it usually meant that there was going to be some bad things going down. The strike failed, and kind of exposing the weakness of the labor movement, and it really takes a long time to truly get going in this country. Racism and ethnic issues really hurt the unions. They weren't willing to allow certain ethnicities, certain races on the unions, even though they were all fighting for the common fight: better pay, less hours, better work conditions, you name it. Most did not want to join up with the Irish, or specifically in the West, the Chinese. And so that issue of racism isn't just in the South. The whole country, racism, its ugly head rears in many places and many facets and elements of society. The Irish, the beef eaters, resented the Chinese, who they called the rice eaters, for competing for jobs because they took the lowest paying jobs, and they claimed that they were driving wages down. Dennis Carney led thousands to attack Chinese immigrants in San Francisco. Denver, Colorado actually had some major anti-Chinese riots in 1880 where the whites went in and kind of sacked what they called Hop Alley. Chinese culture became synonymous with drug use, with opium use, and prostitution, because a lot of the red light districts in many of the cities were in the Chinese sector of the cities, and so they thought they were cleaning out crime when most Chinese were just trying to make a living and make a life. Their culture, like I said, was equated with drugs and prostitutes, boiled down to the lowest common denominator. Very racist notions of what the Chinese were about. Wages were being driven down by the immigrants. And so in response to this, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which stopped all Chinese immigration in the United States. And they extended it. It was a 10-year bill. They extended it in 1892. They extended it in 1902. And so for over 30 years, the Chinese are excluded from coming to this country. It lasted actually all the way until 1943, until World War II, and when China is one of our allies fighting the Japanese in the Pacific. They're often called the forgotten ally of World War II. There was even attempts to strip their citizenship away. They were thwarted in the courts. And so this kind of is just a big, ugly issue that's going on across the United States in terms of immigrants and ethnicities, and it's an ugly era for race relations. Hayes was denounced by the Republicans. He didn't do a very good job, I guess, in his one term as president. And so in 1880, they chose the Ohio resident James Garfield for the new candidate in the election. He was a half-breed member, meaning that he wanted civil service reform. He wasn't for the stalwarts. He wasn't one that thought that you should give your buddies a job just because you were their friends and they helped you out. They should be qualified to get a job in the government. His vice presidential running mate was Chester A. Arthur, which is a very aristocratic sounding name. Chester A. Arthur, who was a stalwart, who was one of the people that was cool with cronyism and giving jobs and spoil system, whatever you want to call it. Graft is the technical term. The Democrats chose Civil War hero Winfield Scott Hancock. Garfield wins the election in 1880. They're all very close in this era, the elections are. His big thing was civil service reform. And sadly, at a train station in Washington, D.C., a fanatic, a man thought that he might lose his job or something, a relative might lose their job, shot him in the back. His name was Charles Guiteau. And Garfield was hospitalized, or he was in a bed for months, and he didn't pass away. After 2-3 months, he finally died. And it really kind of was his dying wish to do civil service reform. And he was the second president assassinated, second president in 20 years killed. I mean, Lincoln was killed in 1865. Ironically or cruelly, in a twist, Abraham Lincoln's son was a witness to the murder or the shooting of President Garfield in the train station in Washington, D.C., which is a little strange. This is a video. If you check out the PBS videos, they have 1-minute shorts on YouTube on each president. They really encapsulate really well, the presidents, what they did, what they achieved, what they failed at. So here's the electoral map. Shows you Garfield, very sectional, very regional, north versus south, with the exception of the West, Nevada, and California. Here's a charcoal rendition of the shooting of President Garfield in the back. Here's the video. And so his replacement was Chester A. Arthur, who's supposed to be a stalwart, who's supposed to be all for the spoil system. But since Garfield died kind of for his cause of civil service reform, since Guiteau shot him for fear of losing a job, they thought that, Arthur was going to do his thing. But he really shocked politicians, himself and others, to change the system, to get rid of the spoil system, which just traced back all the way to 1828, 1829, with the election of Andrew Jackson. And so reform was supported by President Garfield, shocking his critics, shocking some of the people that were even on his side, who were members of the stalwart faction of the Republican Party. The Pendleton Act of 1883 made it mandatory that campaign contributions from federal employees were illegal. It used to be that if you worked for the government, you had to contribute to the people in office, to their campaigns. Doesn't seem right, but apparently that was the way it used to be. It also established, most importantly, the Civil Service Commission to make appointments to federal jobs on the basis of merit. You had to be qualified. You had to be good at what you did. You had to have knowledge and experience to get a job in the government to help run our country. And so civil service reform forced politicians to gain support through other methods for money, mainly through big business leaders and corporation donations. But that's kind of the legacy of President Garfield. I'm a resident of Garfield County here in Colorado, which is named after President Garfield, not the cat. Although our sheriff's department for a while did have the cat as their logo. There's Mount Garfield around here near Grand Junction. So that's kind of what we have for our closing here. This is a political cartoon of everyone listening and trying to figure out what Arthur's going to do with civil service reform. This is kind of showing I'm not sure. We're just going to skip that. If you check out those videos, I appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments, let me know. We'll move on to our next section of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.